What did medieval China really look like? Welcome to Collapse. Today, we dive into medieval China, from dazzling dynasties to fallen kingdoms, brilliant scholars to ruthless generals. Between chaos and grandeur, revolutionary inventions and bloody intrigues, we will discover how China traversed its own dark ages, to be reborn again and again. But before we embark on a new adventure, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on anything. Thank you, and have a great journey. To properly situate this era, it is essential to consider the global context. Around the year 200 Anno Domini, the Roman Empire is still powerful in the Mediterranean, although the crisis of the 3rd century looms on the horizon. In India, the Gupta Empire will appear a little later, while in the regions of East Africa, the Kingdom of Axum is gaining influence. On the American continent, pre-Columbian civilizations like the Maya are already building large cities and developing writing systems. The world's history does not follow a single timeline, and the concept of the Middle Ages is really centered on Europe, where the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 marks the transition from antiquity. Western historians have sometimes sought to draw parallels with other civilizations, hence the idea of a Chinese Middle Ages, stretching from the end of the Han Dynasty in 220 to the fall of the Song Dynasty in 1279. To understand why the year 220 is a crucial milestone, let's go back to the Han Dynasty, one of the most important in all of Chinese history. Its rule extends from 206 before Christ to 220 Anno Domini. On the international stage, remember that in Europe, this period partly corresponds to the Roman High Empire. Augustus founded the Principate in 27 before Christ, and the Pax Romana extends over the Mediterranean basin. In China, the Han Empire had already experienced several centuries of prosperity, punctuated by sometimes violent but generally controlled troubles. The Han established a highly structured imperial administration, supported by a network of officials recruited for their skills, selected through examinations and recommendations. At the heart of this system is Confucianism, a philosophy based on social harmony, filial piety, the importance of education, and morality. Unlike in Roman Europe, where more emphasis is placed on law, Han China is organized around rights and an ethics that values respect for hierarchy and the authority of the emperor. However, over the course of the 2nd century Anno Domini, the Han Dynasty began to crack. Several factors converge. At the court, young emperors succeed older predecessors, giving way to political quarrels. Eunuchs, who play an administrative and political role in the imperial palace, become increasingly powerful and often corrupt. As they gain influence, some regional governors, sometimes former generals, amass considerable local power of their own. This situation is reminiscent of the fragmentation of power in the Roman Empire at the same time, where the ambitions of certain generals regularly led to usurpations and civil wars. Moreover, the concentration of land in the hands of a small number of large families causes great resentment among rural populations. Thousands of dispossessed or ruined peasants are forced to turn to local leaders, willing to offer them protection and work, but who, in return, demand their military loyalty. Tensions escalate at the end of the 2nd century. The most famous example is the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184, a major social and religious movement that shakes the imperial authority. The Yellow Turbans revolt to denounce corruption and misery in the countryside, gaining the support of many peasants, tired of paying crushing taxes to finance the court and wars at the borders. In this unstable environment, multiple military factions emerge, each led by a general or a warlord, eager to extend their influence. Names like Cao Cao, Liu Bei, or Sun Quan stand out at the end of the Han period, and they quickly acquire an almost mythical dimension in Chinese history. Each of them controls a part of the territory, raises their own army, and harbors more or less pronounced imperial ambitions. A weakened imperial court, an emperor often reduced to a puppet, autonomous regional military leaders, the path is paved toward political fragmentation. In 220, after years of influence struggle at the court, Cao Pi, the son of Cao Cao, forces the last Han emperor to abdicate and proclaims himself emperor of Wei. This event marks the official end of the Han Dynasty and the beginning of the Three Kingdoms period, one of the most famous eras in Chinese history. However, it is essential to note that this fragmentation does not occur overnight. The foundations of a unified empire laid by the Han were gradually undermined by rivalries, peasant revolts, and inadequate management of land and resources. As the Han Dynasty collapses, the Roman Empire itself enters a zone of turbulence with the crisis of the 3rd century, marked by barbarian invasions, epidemics, and numerous power struggles. Thus, it is fascinating to note how, thousands of kilometers apart, two great empires of late antiquity simultaneously engage in periods of internal crises and fragmentation. Yet, while Rome eventually split into two empires, Western and Eastern, China divides into multiple kingdoms and dynasties, each attempting, in their own way, to restore unity. This dynamic will continue over the centuries, nurturing a rich historical narrative of alliances, conquests, administrative reforms, and technical inventions. When in the year 220, the last Han Emperor, Xian, abdicates, the beginning of a new era, one where three rival states will vie for supremacy over China. These three entities are geographically divided quite distinctly. In the north, the Wei, dominated by the Cao Cao family, controls the Central Plain, the traditional cradle of Chinese power. In the west and southwest, the Shu, led by Liu Bei, rules over Sichuan, a mountainous region reputed difficult to conquer. Finally, in the east and southeast, the Wu, governed by Sun Quan, relies on the lower Yangtze Valley, rich in fertile lands and river resources. This tripartition will shape the politics, military strategy, and culture of the period in a climate of constant competition among the three kingdoms. Cao Cao, who died in 220, is the powerful military leader who paved the way for the Wei kingdom. His son, Cao Pi, is the one who officially marks the end of the Han. While in many stories Cao Cao appears as a manipulative tyrant, the truth is more nuanced. He was also a brilliant strategist and a cultivated poet, symbolizing a certain political pragmatism found in his famous phrase, "Better to betray the world than let the world betray me." Facing him, Liu Bei founds the Shu kingdom. Unlike Cao Cao, Liu Bei comes from a rather modest background, even though he claims distant ancestry with the Han Dynasty. He embodies the image of the virtuous sovereign, respectful of Confucian values, and concerned with the well-being of his subjects. He is surrounded by talented advisors, including Zhuge Liang. The latter, a true genius of strategy, makes history through his military inventions, such as the repeating crossbow, and his legendary maneuvers. One of the most famous, the empty city stratagem, tells how Zhuge Liang reportedly managed to repel a numerically superior enemy by cleverly bluffing that the city he was defending was full of traps. The third major protagonist of this period is Sun Quan, sovereign of Wu. He inherits power after the death of his elder brother and manages to maintain the independence of his kingdom by deftly exploiting the rivalries between Wei and Shu. Under his reign, the Jiangdong region prospers economically, thanks to the mild climate and a relatively stable administration. Sun Quan is recognized for his political acumen, at times forging alliances with the Shu, at other times breaking with them to face the ambitions of the Wei. The period of the Three Kingdoms is so famous in the Chinese imagination, partly because of its spectacular battles. One of the most legendary is undoubtedly the Battle of Red Cliffs in 208, which took place slightly before the official formation of the Three Kingdoms, but determined their future distribution. Cao Cao, with a formidable army, set out to conquer the south, hoping to quickly unify China under his authority. But on the Yangtze River, at Red Cliffs, he ran into an unexpected alliance, that of Liu Bei and Sun Quan. The Wei troops suffered a crushing defeat, notably due to a fire attack that set their fleet ablaze. Popular accounts often attribute this victory to a miraculous wind invoked by Zhuge Liang to direct the flames onto Cao Cao's ships. While the historical reality may differ from these legends, the idea of a quasi-mystical intervention has left a lasting impression. After this defeat, the unity of China under Cao Cao recedes, and the southern kingdoms, Shu and Wu, consolidate their positions. However, confrontations continue in various forms, notably between Wei and Shu. Zhuge Liang, faithful to Liu Bei and then to his son, leads several campaigns to the north to try to retake the central plain, without definitive success. Meanwhile, Wu sometimes has to confront Liu Bei, as alliances are ephemeral and dictated by changing political interests. This perpetual balancing act maintains a fragile equilibrium. No kingdom manages to completely dominate the others, which explains the relative longevity of this period of fragmentation. Behind the epic tales and great generals' names, everyday life remains difficult for the population. The wars cause massive migrations. People flee conflict zones and regroup where local power is strong enough to offer protection. Peasants endure grain requisitions and forced labor to maintain military and defensive infrastructure. Despite these constraints, each kingdom strives to establish an administration inspired by the Han model. Scholars retain a certain prestige, tasked with collecting taxes and managing irrigation, crucial for agricultural production. However, the fragmentation of the territory and constant military pressure reduce the scope of the imperial examination, meant to promote merit and competence. Often, key positions go to close relatives of the ruling families or loyalists, rewarded for their support on the battlefield. Paradoxically, this period of conflict and instability also fosters cultural creativity. Poets and painters express nostalgia for a more peaceful era or celebrate martial bravery. Confucian ideals of loyalty, justice, and filial piety are tested in a context where military strength prevails. In the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written in the 14th century but based on earlier chronicles, the camaraderie between Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei becomes a symbol of unwavering brotherhood, foreshadowing the concept of knightly honor found in different forms in some medieval European traditions. The history of the Three Kingdoms gradually ends in the second half of the 3rd century. The kingdom of Shu, weakened by costly and unsuccessful military campaigns, falls to Wei in 263. By this stage, Liu Bei's forces had already been decimated, and his successor lacks the means to resist. But Wei itself doesn't remain at the top for long, as the Sima family, influential at its court, seizes power in 265. Sima Yan, known as Emperor Wu of Jin, then founds the Jin Dynasty and soon invades the kingdom of Wu. In 280, China is briefly reunified under the Jin banner. Unfortunately, this reunification is short-lived. Internal conflicts and invasions from the north will soon plunge the country back into another period of turmoil. We are in the year 265. At this time, China has just emerged from the period of the Three Kingdoms, during which Wei, Shu, and Wu vied for the legacy of the Han Dynasty. Within the kingdom of Wei, the Sima family patiently wove their web. Sima Yi, a renowned general and formidable strategist, had already exerted considerable influence by the end of the Wei era. His grandson, Sima Yan, continued this ascent. He deposed the reigning sovereign and proclaimed himself emperor, inaugurating the Western Jin Dynasty. Taking the name Emperor Wu Di, he inherited the administration and military structure of Wei, enabling him to consolidate the north of China, still marked by decades of civil war. The objective of the new Jin court is clear: to restore the unity lost since the fall of the Han. Sima Yan, to achieve this, seeks to rely on the bureaucratic framework bequeathed by his predecessors. Educated officials, trained in Confucian classics, continue to manage tax collection and the maintenance of communication routes, while generals are in charge of pacifying the border territories. Initially, this arrangement works relatively well. Major conflicts subside, and the population regains a semblance of stability. The most resounding victory of the Western Jin Dynasty occurs in 280 when its troops conquer the kingdom of Wu, the last vestige of the Three Kingdoms period. For the first time since the end of the Han Dynasty, the entire Chinese territory becomes nominally unified under a single emperor. For the population, this reunification represents a breath of hope. The constant chaos and feudal rivalries that had defined the Three Kingdoms seem finally to end. Major trade routes are reactivated, and many families displaced by the conflicts begin to resettle. However, this unity is fragile. Two major factors compromise the longevity of the Jin Empire. First, the rivalry between powerful aristocratic clans, each seeking to assert its influence at court. In medieval China, the concept of the Great Family is not just a matter of lineage. It encompasses networks of patronage, matrimonial alliances, and considerable economic power. Secondly, the imperial house itself, the Sima family, is torn by internal struggles. There are plots, assassinations, and coups, often triggered by the fear of another prince seizing the throne. The climax of this discord occurs between 291 and 306, a period known as the War of the Eight Princes. 8 members of the Sima family, all bearing princely titles, violently vie for imperial power. Each prince allies himself with aristocratic clans or factions of the bureaucracy, inciting a chain of rebellions and intrigues. Beyond the palace, this civil war destabilizes the army and creates an atmosphere of panic throughout the empire. Historians consider that this succession of internal conflicts significantly weakened the Jin Dynasty, as it not only exhausted financial resources, but also broke the bond of trust between the ruling elite and the population. While the Sima princes tear each other apart, the northern borders of China become sieves. Several nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples take advantage of the instability to make incursions, gradually establishing themselves permanently on parcels of territory. In the perspective of world history, this situation echoes the pressure exerted, at the same time, by the barbarians on the Western Roman Empire. Just as in Europe, where Germanic or Hunnic populations settle on Roman lands, China sees foreign groups gradually appropriating certain strategic regions. In 316, a dramatic event occurs. The capital of the Western Jin, Chang'an, falls into the hands of the invaders. The imperial court flees, marking the end of this first phase of the Jin Dynasty. After the loss of the north, members of the Sima family and their followers retreat to the city of Jiangkang, present-day Nanjing. This substitute capital, located to the south of the Yangtze River, becomes the seat of what is called the Eastern Jin Dynasty, 317-420. The retreat to the south is not just a choice by default, it also proves to be a smart defensive strategy. The Yangtze forms a natural barrier for cavalry coming from the northern steppes. Furthermore, the south is less exposed to sudden incursions, and its more humid climate offers favorable conditions for rice agriculture. The aristocrats and scholars who left Chang'an or Luoyang bring with them their libraries, family archives, and administrative knowledge. In this southern refuge, an imperial court is recreated, albeit reduced, but still rich in talents and intellectual traditions. The movement of this literate elite leads to a true cultural blossoming in the south. Noble families, in search of prestige, sponsor literature, poetry, calligraphy, and painting. A refined style emerges, marked by the quest for elegance and the love of landscapes. These southern aristocrats, beneficiaries of a milder climate and relatively fertile lands, also re-establish a stable economy around the river and irrigation canals. Many scholars cultivate an ideal of elegant retreat amid philosophical discussions, composing poems and strolling through gardens. Buddhism, already present under the late Han, gains further influence during this period. Buddhist monks, often from Central Asia or India, establish monasteries and translate sacred texts into Chinese. The elites, in search of spirituality in an unstable world, financially support these foundations, which contributes to spreading the Buddhist religion throughout the Yangtze Basin. Even though the Eastern Jin lost control of the north, they continue to claim themselves as the legitimate heirs of the mandate of heaven, a fundamental principle of Chinese politics that asserts a dynasty receives heaven's authorization to govern. In official proclamations, the Jin emperors assert their ambition to one day reconquer the north and restore unity. Although this ambition remains largely theoretical, it nonetheless provides prestige to the regime of Jiangkang. A part of the population from the north, fleeing nomadic invasions, also migrates south, strengthening the agricultural workforce and administrative expertise. On the international front, the division of China into two zones, the north dominated by states founded by non-Han peoples, and the south under the Jin, sometimes echoes the partition of the Roman Empire between East and West. At the beginning of the 5th century, while Rome suffers the sack of the Visigoths, southern China still manages to maintain a brilliant court, even if its military means remain limited. Over the decades, the Eastern Jin Dynasty is undermined by new internal tensions. Aristocratic clans vie for the emperor's ear, and some provincial governors acquire a form of autonomy close to independence. In 420, General Liu Yu, relying on the legitimacy conferred by his success against some northern enemies, forces the Jin emperor to abdicate. He founds his own dynasty, known as the Song, not to be confused with the Great Song Dynasty that will come later in 960. This event marks the end of the Eastern Jin and the beginning of the period of the Northern and Southern dynasties, where China is durably split into two distinct political entities. When the Western Jin dynasty collapses in 316, the nomadic populations established in northern China take control of the former capitals, such as Luoyang and Chang'an. Then, when the Eastern Jin dynasty disappears in 420, China is clearly divided. In the north, dynasties founded by peoples of non-Han origin, Xianbei, Xiongnu, and others, and in the south, lineages of Chinese tradition that govern from Jiangkang, present-day Nanjing. This configuration, lasting until 581, is called the period of the Northern and Southern Dynasties. The north experiences a succession of regimes, but one of them, the Northern Wei Dynasty, from 386 to 534, stands out for its longevity and impact. Originating from the Xianbei people, it initiates a massive Sinicization process, adoption of the Chinese language, clothing style, imperial administration, and notably, the promotion of Buddhism. Emperor Xiaowen, one of the prominent figures of this dynasty, pushes reform to the extent of prohibiting the Xianbei from speaking their native language in hopes of merging the nomadic elites into Chinese culture. This ambition encounters resistance, but it embodies the desire to build a stable state based on the administrative principles bequeathed by the Han and the Jin. In the south, the situation is equally fluid, even though the dynasties claim a more Chinese tradition. Four main dynasties succeed one another. The Southern Song, distinct from the future Great Song dynasty that will emerge in 960, the Southern Qi, the Liang, and the Chen. Each of these dynasties is often founded by a general or a high-ranking official who seizes power by force, overthrowing the reigning lineage. Despite this instability, the South claims to be the legitimate heir of the Han civilization, valuing a literate bureaucracy, the arts, and a certain courtly elegance. However, the central authority remains fragile. Palace intrigues, coups, and internal conflicts punctuate the period, preventing any military expansion to the north. In this fragmented political landscape, Buddhism becomes a true cultural cement, present in both halves of the country. Monasteries multiply, offering assistance to the needy and sometimes forming major intellectual and artistic centers. In the north, the presence of communities from Central Asia and the influence of nomadic populations encourage the emergence of grandiose Buddhist art, as evidenced by the famous Yungang and Longmen caves, where colossal statues of Buddha are carved into the rock. In the south, the literary tradition continues, with poetry and calligraphy notably symbolizing aristocratic refinement. Scholars cultivate the art of withdrawn elegance, often associated with a life close to nature and the study of classical and Buddhist texts. This north-south division, so marked in political structures, does not prevent economic, diplomatic, and cultural exchanges. Merchants and envoys travel across the Yangtze River, carrying not only goods but also ideas and techniques. The north, influenced by nomadic culture, develops architectural styles inspired by steppe traditions while incorporating Chinese elements. The south, on the other hand, exports more agricultural and artisanal products, taking advantage of its fertile lands and maritime openness to Southeast Asia. Despite political divergences, this continuous interaction weaves the thread of a Chinese civilization that never quite breaks its cultural unity. While the southern dynasties succeed one another at a rapid pace, Southern Song, Southern Qi, Liang, Chen, the north completes its own cycle of fragmentation. The northern Wei, though powerful, splits in 534 into two entities, the eastern Wei and the western Wei, later giving rise to the northern Qi dynasty and the northern Zhou dynasty. Although this adds to the confusion, it does not last forever. In 557, the northern Zhou dynasty manages to take over its northern rivals and unify most of northern China. This success provides the northern Zhou court with a solid enough base to one day threaten the southern dynasties. Meanwhile, the South continues to exhaust itself in internal power struggles. Although rich in agricultural resources, notably thanks to rice cultivation in the Yangtze Basin, and commercially dynamic, it fails to organize militarily to conquer the north. The southern emperors, often too busy containing conspiracies within their own court, lack the stability required to launch a large-scale offensive toward the northern regions. The balance between the two blocks thus remains fragile, and the idea of reunification seems distant, even if it continues to haunt the collective imagination, nourished by the memory of the great Han Dynasty and its unifying power. The turning point occurs in 581, when a certain Yang Jian, a high-ranking dignitary of the northern Zhou court, takes the reins of power. Thanks to his strategic position within the imperial entourage and his marriage alliances with the royal family, he manages to eliminate or neutralize his opponents. He deposes the child emperor and declares himself sovereign under the name of Sui Wendi, founding the Sui Dynasty. From then on, Yang Jian sets out to reorganize the administration and the military, taking as models both Han traditions and innovations implemented under the Northern Way. His objective is twofold: to stabilize the north and prepare the reconquest of the south. In 589, this project comes to fruition. Sui troops sweep over the kingdom of Chen, the last southern dynasty. Unable to resist the military and logistical superiority of Yang Jian, the south is conquered. For the first time in nearly 3 centuries, China regains its unity under the rule of a single emperor. This long-awaited triumph should not overshadow the complexity of the path taken. Numerous short-lived dynasties succeeded one another, each bringing its own share of political experiments, cultural accommodations, and artistic legacies. The anecdote suggests that Yang Jian relied on his family ties with the imperial house of Zhou to justify his rise to power. According to some chronicles, he presented himself as the restorer of order, a classic narrative in China, where heaven is believed to confer the mandate to the one who can ensure the harmony of the empire. In practice, it was the court's weakness, the population's weariness of repeated conflicts, and Yang Jian's skill in forming alliances that made the rise of the Sui Dynasty possible. On a global scale, let's recall that in the 6th century, Western Europe was fragmented into various kingdoms following the fall of Rome, while the Byzantine Empire in the east attempted to maintain its grip around the Mediterranean. In the Indian world, the gradual end of the Gupta dynasty was occurring. In China, this international context was marked by a new shift. After nearly 3 centuries of divisions between the north and the south, the Sui finally managed to restore central authority, laying the foundation for what would become the golden age of the Tang. When Yang Jian seized power in 581 and founded the Sui Dynasty, he proclaimed himself emperor under the name of Wendi. From the outset, Wendi clearly expressed his will to reunify China, an ideal that had haunted minds since the fall of the Han. In 589, he annihilated the Chen Dynasty, the last southern stronghold, thus sealing the fate of the north-south division. For the first time since the Jin Dynasty in 280, China regained its unity under the rule of a single sovereign. In a country weary of conflicts, this reunification was welcomed with relief, though the territorial organization initially remained fragile, requiring a strengthening of the administration. To restore a strong central power, Wendi relied on a remarkably efficient bureaucracy. He imposed uniform laws across all provinces and codified the rules governing court life and the elites. An ambitious land reform, the equal field system, planned to allocate land based on the size of peasant families to combat the land concentration that had favored the rise of great landowners under previous dynasties. This measure aimed to ensure rural stability and provide the state with a sound fiscal base. parallel, Wendy introduced an embryonic version of the 3 departments and 6 ministries system, which would be perfected under the Tang. The idea was to separate executive power, the drafting of edicts, and administrative supervision to prevent any single group from concentrating all responsibilities. Under this model, each ministry, whether of war, rights, works, or finance, had specific prerogatives. Ultimately, this system offered a better distribution of competencies and greater efficiency in managing the vast empire. Notably, Emperor Wendy himself led a rather austere lifestyle. Unlike many rulers of the time, he avoided lavish expenses and closely monitored the state's finances. Such sobriety sharply contrasted with the personality of his son and heir, who would meet a more flamboyant and tragic fate. Beyond unification, the most spectacular achievement of the Sui was the construction, or more precisely, the extension and interconnection, of a gigantic river network called the Grand Canal. The idea was not entirely new. Multiple canals had already existed since previous dynasties. But under the Sui, these waterways were connected and complemented to create an uninterrupted navigation corridor between the north and the south. The numbers are staggering. We are talking about thousands of kilometers of canals, mobilizing millions of peasants subjected to grueling labor. The working conditions were terrible, and discontent was growing among a population that felt exploited. The immense infrastructure will nonetheless have lasting effects. From an economic point of view, the Grand Canal becomes the main transport axis for foodstuffs, especially rice, from the fertile southern regions to the more arid north. This solves a major logistical challenge, supplying the great capitals, particularly Luoyang, without relying solely on slow and dangerous land routes. The canal also facilitates the movement of troops during military campaigns, which will prove essential for maintaining the cohesion of the empire. Beyond the purely utilitarian aspect, this river network also encourages cultural exchange. Scholars, Buddhist monks, artists, and merchants travel more easily. Ideas spread, fashion trends from the south can reach the northern regions and vice versa. There is an unprecedented mingling of customs and techniques, contributing both to unity and to the creative effervescence of China under the Sui. When Yang Di succeeds his father Wendy in 604, he inherits a centralized empire, but one still fragile in its balances. The emperor surrounds himself with luxury, lives a lavish life, and multiplies military expeditions to extend his aura beyond the borders. However, his campaigns in Korea turn into a disaster. Chinese troops become bogged down in prolonged sieges, far from their bases, and suffer heavy losses. The failure is compounded by an exorbitant economic cost. Maintaining the army on the spot, keeping garrisons, and organizing logistics over long distances. In parallel, work on the Grand Canal continues at a frantic pace. Teams of requisitioned peasants are constantly solicited to dig new sections or upgrade old ones. Exhausted and often starving, these workers eventually harbor deep anger against the imperial power. When orders to increase taxes come down to fund the war in Korea and the emperor's lavish lifestyle, the situation becomes explosive. Peasant revolts break out in several provinces, fueled by local leaders aspiring to overthrow the Sui Dynasty. Among these charismatic leaders is Li Yuan, a provincial governor of aristocratic origin, who manages to rally to his cause both discontented elites and soldiers deserting Yang's army. Very quickly, Li Yuan takes control of the Chang'an region. In 618, Emperor Yang is assassinated in a plot concocted within his own court, abandoned by his supporters. The Sui Dynasty, disoriented and undermined by uprisings, collapses almost immediately. This rapid collapse should not overshadow the considerable legacy left by the Sui. In less than 40 years, they effectively reshaped the empire's geography, thanks to the Grand Canal, while reinstating strong administrative centralization. When the Sui Dynasty collapses in 618, the Chinese empire finds itself once again weakened. It is then that Yuan emerges, a former governor under the Sui. In 617, he launches a rebellion, seizes the capital Chang'an, today's Xi'an, and proclaims himself Emperor Gaozu of the Tang Dynasty in 618. Although he lays the foundations of the new regime, it is his son, Li Shimin, who will truly forge the power of the Tang. Li Shimin proves to be a formidable strategist and politician. During the bloody episode of the Xuanwu Gate in 626, he eliminates his rival brothers and forces his father to abdicate. He then becomes Emperor Taizong the same year. The reign of Taizong marks a clear break from the previous instability. Considered one of the greatest emperors of China, he consolidates the administration through reforms that relax fiscal policy and encourage scholarly talents. Under his leadership, the state imposes new governance standards, promotes justice, and establishes skillful diplomatic alliances. Taizong opens the court to different religious currents, from Buddhism to Zoroastrianism, thus reflecting his reputation as an enlightened emperor. On a military level, the beginning of the Tang is part of a strategy of securing an expansion. The campaigns against nomadic peoples, notably the Eastern Turks, help stabilize the northern borders. Moreover, the Silk Road, crossing Central Asia, becomes a key vector for trade, the exchange of ideas, and the affirmation of Chinese power. The oases of Central Asia, such as Kucha or Karachar, come under Tang influence, ensuring the prosperity of caravanners and the security of exchanges. Under the Tang Dynasty, China entered an era of unprecedented prosperity. Chang'an, the capital, was its dazzling symbol. It is estimated that 1 million inhabitants populated the city, with an ethnic and cultural diversity that even surprised travelers from afar. Sogdian, Persian, Turkish merchants, and even Byzantine diplomats roamed its streets, while embassies and trade posts multiplied. Luoyang, the second capital, also served as an artistic and intellectual hub. The artistic peak is particularly visible in Tang poetry. Figures like Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang Wei created masterpieces celebrating the beauty of landscapes, the depth of human emotions, or the nostalgia for an idealized past. Li Bai, nicknamed the Immortal Poet, led a bohemian life filled with wine, inspiring many popular anecdotes. The painting of landscapes, known as Shan Shui, developed alongside, with attention to the depiction of mountains, rivers, and mists, in an approach that was both realistic and spiritual. Religious diversity manifested more than ever. Buddhism, already rooted from previous periods, reached its peak. Grand temples were erected, sometimes funded by the aristocracy or the imperial family. Taoism, on the other hand, benefited from a special relationship with the Tang court, as the Li family claimed an ancestry linked to the legendary founder Laozi. Confucianism, the moral and administrative cement, remained the state doctrine. Officials had to master classical texts to validate their intellectual legitimacy. Moreover, foreign religions like Nestorianism, a branch of Eastern Christianity, or Islam, found their place in the capital's enclaves, making Chang'an a true cosmopolitan melting pot. Trade on the Silk Road was about both material goods, silk, porcelain, tea, spices, and technical knowledge, paper, metallurgy methods. Fashion trends inspired by Persian or Sogdian styles influenced the Chinese elites, especially in court clothing or the hairstyles of high society women. This period thus saw China widely open to the world, a movement that would nurture cultural and artistic radiance for centuries to come. At the heart of Tang's success was a refined bureaucracy. The Tang perfected the imperial examination system inherited from the Han and Sui. Now, to access state positions, one had to excel in exams on Confucian classics, rhetoric, and poetry. Obtaining the title of Jinshi, meaning imperial doctorate, became the dream of many scholars. Candidates sometimes dedicated years to study, some isolating themselves to immerse in books. These exams offered a theoretically open path for social promotion, although in practice, only those who could afford to study could compete. The Tang agrarian and fiscal system was inspired by the equal field system implemented by the Sui. Peasants received a plot of land in exchange for a tax paid in kind, in textiles, and in the form of occasional labor. This organization aimed to limit the accumulation of land by powerful aristocratic families or by Buddhist monasteries known for their wealth in land. As time passed, land concentration continued nonetheless, creating regional disparities and fueling social tensions. The social hierarchy remained dominated by the state nobility, often from prestigious aristocratic lineages. Next were the literati, whose authority was legitimized by success in imperial exams. Merchants, despite their wealth, were placed lower on the scale of prestige, due to a Confucian view favoring agriculture and administration. Additionally, high society women enjoyed relative freedom under the Tang compared to other eras. They were seen engaging in horse riding, hunting, and even actively participating in literary circles. The Tang Dynasty experienced a unique moment in Chinese history with the ascent to supreme power of a woman, Wu Zetian, in 624. Initially a concubine of Emperor Taizong, then Empress Consort of Gaozong, she gradually managed to eliminate her opponents and take the helm of the empire. In 690, she founded her own dynasty, the Zhou, temporarily interrupting the Tang lineage. To legitimize her reign, she relied on Buddhism, funding the construction of colossal statues and granting privileges to monasteries. She also developed the imperial examination system, broadening the selection of officials to gain new support. Wu Zetian's personality remains controversial. Official historians often portray her as ambitious and cruel, accused of resorting to assassination to cement her power. Other, more recent sources emphasize her role as a reformer. She supposedly promoted a more effective administration, opened the court to external talents, and shattered the glass ceiling that confined women to subordinate roles. After her death in 705, her son, then members of the Tang clan, regained control of the empire, erasing the brief Zhou dynasty and reinstating the authority of Li Yuan's descendants. Despite its grandeur, the Tang dynasty entered a phase of decline starting in the mid-8th century. The rebellion of An Lushan between 755 and 763 marked a major turning point. An Lushan, a frontier general of Sogdian or Turkish origin, rose in revolt and marched on Chang'an, forcing Emperor Xuanzong to flee the capital. This tragic event resulted in millions of victims and the destruction of vast agricultural regions, plunging the empire into lasting chaos. The imperial favorite, Yang Guifei, accused of collusion with An Lushan or his entourage, was put to death. This dramatic episode has inspired numerous poems and stories, sometimes tinged with romanticism, sometimes with despair. After the rebellion, imperial power never truly recovered. Military governors, initially appointed to defend the borders, gradually gained quasi-feudal autonomy. They raised their own troops, collected their taxes, and did not hesitate to challenge the court's authority. The Tang state also faced recurring financial crises, notably due to the high cost of defense and internal unrest. The emperors attempted reforms but struggled to contain rival factions. New peasant revolts erupted here and there, further aggravating the fragmentation of the empire. Finally, in 907, a former rebel leader named Yuan deposed the last Tang emperor and founded the later Liang Dynasty, ushering in the period of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. Despite this collapse, the Tang legacy remains immense. Culturally, China had never experienced such a proliferation of poets, painters, and thinkers. The Tang also left behind a model of centralized administration and a cosmopolitanism that shaped the image of China throughout Asia. The Tang court long served as a reference in Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia for dress codes, writing, and governance practices. In the end, the Tang dynasty embodies an exceptional synthesis of military power, cultural refinement, and openness to the world. Its memory remains vivid in the Chinese imagination, celebrated for the poetry and splendor of the court, but also remembered as a warning about the difficulty of maintaining a vast and diverse empire faced with internal rebellions and frontier threats. The post-Tang period, though marked by fragmentation, would only perpetuate in its own way the creative momentum initiated under this dynasty, paving the way for the rise of the Song Dynasty, which in turn would shine with its technological and cultural advances. After the fall of the Tang Dynasty in 907, the generals and warlords who had gradually gained regional power seized control. In northern China, there was a rapid succession of 5 later dynasties. These 5 dynasties, later Liang, later Tang, later Jin, later Han, and later Zhou, vied for the central plain, each of their leaders harboring the ambition to restore the unity of the empire. But this goal remained elusive. As soon as one sovereign was installed, he had to contend with palace plots, military uprisings, or the emergence of a rival ready to seize the throne. The changes in dynasty often resulted from coup d'etat. A disgraced general would gather his troops, overthrow the reigning emperor, and establish his own lineage, only to be overthrown by another general. For an audience not familiar with this period, the designation of 5 dynasties might seem misleading, as the reigns are short and political revolutions frequent. Yet, there is a certain continuity. The area controlled by these successive dynasties remains essentially the central plain, the historical heart of China since antiquity. The later names often reflect a symbolic or political link with the glorious Tang Dynasty. For example, the later Tang, between 923 and 936, claims to be part of the lineage of the previous Golden Age, even though the reality of its power is limited to a much smaller territory and less stable organization. Meanwhile, the southern provinces completely escape the influence of the 5 dynasties. No fewer than 10 kingdoms appear there, some of which, like Wu, Yue, Min, or Chu, persist longer than others, which are short-lived. The local princes seek to strengthen their authority, sometimes forging alliances or engaging in neighboring disputes, but overall, the south experiences notable economic prosperity. Thanks to irrigated rice cultivation and a flourishing maritime trade, some port cities rapidly develop, attracting merchants and artisans. The more numerous rivers and the access to the South China Sea promote trade exchanges with Southeast Asia. This relative material ease contrasts with the more turbulent situation in the north, where wars and court intrigues are common. Culturally, this fragmentation does not signify a halt in intellectual or artistic life. Quite the opposite. Many scholars move from one principality to another, offering their skills to princes eager to consolidate their prestige. The southern courts thus compete to attract poets, calligraphers, and painters. Buddhist monasteries, for their part, continue their role as centers of knowledge, preserving libraries and transmitting classical Chinese culture. Even in the absence of strong imperial authority, Chinese civilization continues to evolve, sometimes with creativity stimulated by competition among rival states. While the south remains fragmented among various kingdoms, the last of the northern 5 dynasties, the later Zhou, manages to establish a certain stability in the central plain. Its influence surpasses that of its immediate predecessors and lays the groundwork for potential reunification. It is in this context that Zhao Kuangyin emerges, a talented general well-liked by his soldiers. In 960, he leads a coup, deposing the child emperor of the later Zhou and proclaiming himself emperor under the name Taizu, founding the Song Dynasty. Instead of launching a series of brutal wars, Zhao Kuangyin adopts a skillful policy to restore China's unity. The general state of fatigue among the population, tired of incessant conflicts, works in his favor. Indeed, many provinces, both north and south, long for peace and security. Rather than militarily subjugating his former rivals, Taizu prefers to forge alliances, use diplomacy, and sometimes buy the surrender of certain territories or gain the support of local princes. This moderate and gradual approach allows him to pacify many regions without having to conduct long sieges. Gradually, the different kingdoms of the south come under Song authority, whether through voluntary submission or negotiated transfer. Once power is consolidated, Zhao Kuangyin endeavors to limit the power of regional generals, aware that the cycle of coups might repeat if military commanders retain too much autonomy. He encourages a return to civilian administration, restores importance to the imperial examination, and strives to rebuild a stable economy. Ideologically, he presents himself as a unifier, a distant heir of the Han Empire and the Tang Dynasty, who would restore the mandate of heaven by guaranteeing order and prosperity. Thus, the Song Dynasty establishes itself and inaugurates a new, less turbulent age, which many historians consider one of the most flourishing periods in Chinese history. At the international level, let us recall that Europe is experiencing the gradual decline of the Carolingian Empire and the rise of feudal powers, while the Islamic world, after the fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate, breaks down into several regional dynasties. In Central Asia, Turkish and Persian influence is strengthening, paving the way for the emergence of new empires. In this vast context, Song China stands out for its economic prosperity, technological advances, and cultural refinement. To begin with, the Song Dynasty takes shape following the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. Zhao Kuangyin, a general of the later Zhou, seizes power in 960. He proclaims himself emperor under the name Taizu and undertakes, with remarkable skill, to subdue the independent kingdoms of northern China. This first phase takes place during the so-called Northern Song period, with its capital at Kaifeng in the Central Plain. However, the new dynasty quickly encounters the neighboring nomadic powers. In the northeast, the Khitans, Liao Dynasty, control vast territories. Later, the Jurchens, Jin Dynasty, assert themselves by overthrowing the Khitans in turn. The Song, lacking a strong military tradition, struggle to defend their borders. They sometimes pay tributes to the nomadic states to maintain peace. This balancing policy remains fragile. In 1127, a turning point occurs. The Jin Dynasty invades Kaifeng. The emperor and his court are captured, an event known as the Jingkang Incident. This national trauma marks the end of the Northern Song. A surviving prince, Zhao Go, flees south and establishes a new capital at Linan, modern-day Hangzhou. He becomes Emperor Gaozong, inaugurating the Southern Song period. The Song retreat behind the Huai River, but this forced withdrawal, paradoxically, fosters exceptional economic and cultural growth. This prosperity of the Song dynasty is partly explained by the intensification of irrigated agriculture in the Yangtze Basin. The introduction of early ripening rice varieties, sometimes imported from Champa, modern-day Vietnam, allows for multiple harvests per year. Agricultural surpluses stimulate population growth. Additionally, paper money, which had timidly developed under the Tang, becomes a common instrument of transactions. First the jiaozi, then the huizi, circulate on a large scale. These monetary innovations facilitate commerce, especially since the southern ports thrive on trade with Southeast Asia, India, and the Arab world. It is also a time of unprecedented urbanization. Hangzhou, the capital of the Southern Song, is covered in commercial districts, restaurants, and theaters, attracting merchants and travelers from sometimes distant regions. The accounts, notably those of Marco Polo in the following century, describe a sumptuous city where the wealth of the shops and entertainments leaves a lasting impression on the minds of foreign visitors. Intellectually, the Song dynasty witnesses the rise of Neo-Confucianism, championed by great thinkers like Zhu Xi, who strives to synthesize Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist teachings to propose a more spiritual and metaphysical view of social order. This philosophy, which emphasizes morality and cosmic harmony, shapes the education of the literate elites. The administration recruits its cadres from candidates who pass the Imperial exams, which require a perfect knowledge of the classics. Neo-Confucianism thus becomes the official state doctrine, influencing Chinese thought and, by extension, East Asia in the long term. Artistically, the Song dynasty shines in landscape painting, shan shui, where masters like Fan Quan, Guo Shi, and Ma Yuan excel in depicting the vastness of mountains, mists, and rivers. There is also an extreme refinement of porcelain, notably in the form of delicate celadons, which are highly prized in international markets. Woodblock printing, already used to disseminate Buddhist texts, expands to various fields: poetry, agriculture, administrative manuals. By the mid-11th century, Bisheng develops movable-type printing, a major revolution in book reproduction, although the complexity of Chinese script slows the spread of this process. The brilliance of the Song dynasty is not limited to culture or economy. It is also based on scientific and technical advances that will mark world history. The compass, whose magnetic principle had already been suspected since the Han Dynasty, becomes widespread for maritime navigation. The Song sailors, masters in the art of exploiting winds and currents, travel maritime routes to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. At the same time, gunpowder is perfected. Initially confined to fireworks, it begins to be used for military purposes: bombs, fire lances, rudimentary explosive projectiles. Although these weapons do not prevent subsequent invasions, they represent a decisive step towards modern artillery. The impact of gunpowder on the battlefield will later be decisive, not only in China, but also in the rest of the world when the technique is transmitted via the Silk Road or Muslim trade networks. Finally, printing, whose advances we have already highlighted, facilitates the circulation of knowledge. Technical treatises, governance manuals, books of medicine, poetry are distributed among the educated elites. Although the literate public remains limited compared to the overall population, this rapid dissemination of texts increases the cultural cohesion of the country, allowing scholars located hundreds of kilometers apart to rely on common references. In the long run, these innovations, compass, gunpowder, printing, will spread outside of China and play a major role in the transformation of societies in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Despite their sophistication and prosperity, the Song suffer militarily. In the north, the Jin Dynasty represents a constant threat. The Song, whose army is less experienced, sometimes prefer to pay tribute to maintain peace. However, the arrival of the Mongols in the 13th century completely disrupts the balance of power. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol Empire extends from the Caspian Sea to northern China, overthrowing the Jin Dynasty in 1234. The southern Song find themselves surrounded. Despite stubborn resistance, they struggle to curb Mongol assaults. Urban defenses utilize gunpowder weapons, but the Mongols, with the expertise of engineers from multiple regions, Persia, the Arab world, and many others, perfect their siege engines. The siege of Xiangyang, between 1267 and 1273, illustrates the tenacity of the Song and the Mongol power. Notably, counterweight trebuchets capable of launching massive projectiles against the walls are used. Finally, the capital Linyang falls in 1276. The young emperor is captured, and the last loyal Song retreat to the southwest until 1279, when they suffer a decisive naval defeat at Yamen. The Mongols, led by Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, proclaim the Yuan dynasty, marking the end of the Song dynasty and, symbolically, the end of the Chinese Middle Ages. The Chinese Middle Ages, which span approximately from the end of the Han Dynasty, 220, until the Mongol conquest, 1279, underscore how Asian civilizations followed their own dynamics of fragmentation, reunification, and growth, often paralleling European upheavals. While medieval Europe was building its cathedrals and perfecting Romanesque and Gothic art, medieval China was erecting Buddhist temples, polishing calligraphy, and opening new trade routes on land and sea. These two worlds, although geographically distant, shared many common issues: the weight of feudalism or military aristocracy, administrative organization, the religious legitimacy of power, and the relentless quest for innovation to overcome geopolitical challenges. Thus, the Chinese Middle Ages constitute a vast historical laboratory, where ideas and techniques were developed that would continue to evolve over the centuries. After the fall of the Song, China would come under Mongol domination, then regain its independence under the Ming in 1368. But it is precisely during this long medieval phase that Chinese civilization forged some of its most remarkable characteristics: a centralized bureaucracy, a scholarly elite aspiring to success in exams, and a pool of inventions capable of reshaping the world order.